I want to welcome you to Research Methods in Psychology. And there's a couple of things I want to break down immediately. That when we talk about research methods, we're talking about more than just psychology. We're talking about the scientific method and how we actually know our world. Research methods has a long history that actually starts thousands of years ago in different philosophical ways to look at the world. When we talk about psychology, we're talking about specifically a relatively newer field of science that looks at the study of human behavior. So, though the class itself is set within a psychology program, and we're mainly going to be using examples from psychology, I want you to think about this a little bit more broadly as far as research methods that are used throughout science. And when we go through this class, the focus of this class is actually teaching you to be good consumers of research and research methodology. In other words, understanding how research is done, what you want to look for, and potential yellow or red flags when consuming research. Some of you may move on to actually become researchers, but that's not necessarily the focus of this class. The class is more focused on how we actually become good consumers of research and how we understand research. The other thing I wanted to say is that this class is actually set up a little bit differently in that there's a lot more activities and a lot more paper writing. And the paper you're going to be writing actually is a research paper to kind of give you a little bit of hands-on experience with the process that's involved in actually doing research. Each week is actually set up in modules, and each module will include chapter readings. It'll include lectures, both a set of slides and these audio lectures that will be available for you to consume. And there will also be assignments. The assignments are actually due at the end of each week, so they're due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. That definitely does not mean that you should wait to the last minute. This is an online asynchronous course, so I would suggest you avoid technical issues by turning things in early, and you have the entire week in which to work on those assignments. Also, this class will have a rolling system of at any time there will be at least 2 weeks available for you to be working on, so you can always work ahead. And this is specifically designed to help you if you, for example, know that you're going to be out for a few days in a week. You can work ahead if you need to make sure that your assignments are all done. So having said that, let's move forward into the class itself and talk about a little bit of what we're focused on when we talk about research methods in this classroom. So the first thing I want to talk about is that there's two broad categories: research producers and research consumers. Producers are those people that actually are focused on creating research and creating science. They're hoping that their research, that their programs of study will inform the sciences that they're in, whether it is biology, whether it's physics, whether it's psychology. But beyond just running good studies, in other words, rigorous studies, studies that stand up to scrutiny, they also want to make sure that their research is being consumed. And that's where that second group comes, research consumers. And research consumers can be lay people, in other words, someone that's just reading a research article, or in fact, more likely reading a media's representation of what that research found. But it can also be professionals. So again, we often will talk about the science practitioner dichotomy, or academic practitioner. So scientists or academics are creating research. Practitioners are applying that research. So think about this in very simplistic terms. What we know about clinical psychology, for instance, which is actually mainly a practitioner field, is based on research. So researchers may actually set up a study to find out if a new particular clinical psychological technique, so for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, has a positive outcome, a positive effect on people that it's used on for various potential psychological problems. The consumers in that case are not just lay people that are reading about it in articles. It's not just people that are actually going into clinical sessions and being counseled. It's also the clinicians themselves, the practitioners that are using this research to guide their interventions. So that's what I really want you to think about, is that it is an entire process, and we often focus on simply the rigor of the original research. Research methods, in fact, is mainly focused on creating good research. But just creating good research isn't enough. It's also, how do we get that information out there? How do we get it out there in a accurate manner? And how do we get it to the consumers? How does it become from science to practice? And also, how does it go from science to being understood by everyone out there as far as what's going on? So a part of this is, as research consumers, we all consume research, whether we recognize it or not. And what I'm hoping to get is to move you from either having a reaction to science and research, either positive or negative, in other words, always rejecting it because it's science, or always accepting it because it's science, and actually become a consumer of research that knows how to go in and ask, did they ask the right questions? What can I draw on this? And not necessarily rely on others to tell you what you should be withdrawing or understanding from the research. A lot of times when I look at media articles, I'll see a couple headlines and one big punch. This is what the research found. When I actually go to the original studies, I'll often find a lot of caveats that were ignored by that media story, that couple of paragraphs that summarize a much larger research study to try to make it consumable by everyone. So having said that, we want to talk about a couple of key terms that are philosophically the assumptions that we build research on. The first one is empiricism. Empiricism is conclusions based on systematic observations, and the idea here is that the best way to know about the world is to systematically make observations. If you want to know when water boils, you don't just throw it on a pot and turn up the heat till it boils. To systematically understand it, you're going to actually first just determine what temperature does water boil at. In other words, you're going to use a gauge to do systematic observations. You're going to find where that boiling point is. And then you're going to have your initial theory. Water boils at this temperature. But then some other people are going to do additional research and find, wait a minute, we found a difference. Does that mean that this research is not valid? And that might bring us to the fact that, okay, water boils at different temperatures based on altitude and also environmental conditions. In other words, how much humidity is in the water. So that starts to create a better theory. Empiricism is the process, and usually there's not going to be a single study that is completely going to tell us everything about the world. There are people that are trying to do studies like that, kind of unified field theories that basically will explain everything. But most of the time, what we're looking at is a series of studies that refine a theory in a way that actually lets us know what's going on. The second term that we want to keep in mind that isn't on this slide is determinism. Determinism is basically, again, it's a psychological, it's not a psychological, it's a philosophical assumption that the world we live in is deterministic, that there are causes and effects, that if we create a methodologically sound study to determine that water boils at a certain temperature with a certain amount of humidity in the air at a certain altitude, that process will be found over and over again under exactly the same conditions, that there is a deterministic universe. Now, not everything falls into determinism and not everything falls into empiricism, but as we're talking about rigorous science, they should have both of these. It should be empirical, the conclusions should be based on systematic observations, and those observations or the theories they're testing should be based on the assumption that we're in a deterministic universe. So again, research producers and consumers. Producers create the research. Consumers understand and apply the research. And again, another way to think about this is science versus practice. The scientists are creating the research, they're doing the studies, but they're not actually applying what they find. They're reporting what they find. The consumer can be the people benefiting from it. It can be people just simply trying to understand it. It can be politicians creating policy about it, but it can also be practitioners putting it into effect. So for example, a scientist might find that a certain region of the brain is strongly associated with motor control of the right arm. A doctor actually doing surgery may actually then try to repair damage to that area to return control of that arm to a person that has lost it. That would be a very blunt example of producing the science versus the consuming the practice. So as I said, what I'm wanting you to become through this class is to become a good producer and consumer of research, but my focus is actually more on consuming. Again, I want to give you the fundamental building blocks, if you will, to become also a good producer, and some of the class is going to be based around that. How do we do research? How do we actually determine if it is methodologically sound. But we also want to be very focused on being a good consumer of research. A good example of this actually is the idea of facilitated learning. And I'm going to pick on this a little bit because it's a personal beef of mine. But the idea behind it is that certain people that are effectively unable to communicate in any way, shape, or form can communicate through facilitated communication. And the idea is you take someone that is quote unquote locked in, so they are showing no actual sign of higher brain function when they're scanned. We basically cannot find any evidence that they are still with us in a meaningful way. In other words, to be blunt, we're talking about people potentially in a vegetative state, at which point they're given a facilitated ability to communicate through the use of their arm. So a facilitated communicator, usually someone that has gone through a program and gets training, picks up their hand and helps them by interpreting the movements to allow them to communicate on a keyboard. And this has actually initially found enormous amounts of press releases. There was studies that found strong evidence that suddenly people that were completely thought to be unreachable or incapable of communication were suddenly strongly communicating answers to questions. So what is there to really talk about here? Well, a couple of scientists basically said, I've got some questions about this. And honestly, I'm coming in wanting to find out, is this true? And what they set up was basically called a single or double blind study. In other words, they made sure that the person that was quote unquote locked in, the person that was not responding in any way normally, would be able to hear questions. They were being communicated both verbally and physically to the person. And then their facilitator would not get this information. What they found in every single case was the facilitator could only help with communication if they also knew the questions. If they didn't, it disappeared. So generally speaking, science ruled that this is not a case of finding a roadway, if you will, to communicate to people that science has declared no longer are physically capable or mentally capable of communicating. What's happening is it's basically a feel-good process that makes the facilitator feel good. It makes the people whose families, the families of these people feel good. But the reality is you're not actually communicating with the person involved. Now, one would think that once this science came out and there was multiple studies that showed it, this would basically stop this entire process. Actually, facilitated learning is still occurring. Facilitated communication is still something that you can actually find in the real world, and there are still academies that teach people. In other words, they've basically just ignored the science. And some people are still willing to pay for facilitated communication because it gives them hope. I am not really making a declaration on whether that hope is worthy of supporting or not. What I am telling you is that the science has pretty much straight out confirmed that this is not what's actually occurring. So when we look at this, that's what we need to look at, is the fact that media stories were initially reporting and initial studies were actually reporting. But then that this was a actual phenomenon. But the consumers started to actually practice this. So there was science, there was practice, it was occurring. And some researchers looked at that as consumers and said, this doesn't sound as rigorous as I think it should be. We could set up a much better study to actually find out, is this occurring? And when they did, they actually didn't find support for it. In other words, they came in, we could find support or we couldn't find support. And that's also one of the things we want to look at is when we're consuming research, we want to ask, was the researchers genuine in trying to set up a study that could either prove or disprove what they're looking for? So just quickly, a learning activity on this. We're wanting to think about the discussion questions. Whenever we're looking at research, we want to think about what kind of study was run. And we also want to ask the questions. Who's running that study? Who's actually funding it? Those are good questions to ask. And any solid research should have that information. Most research is actually done by universities. But if there is federal funding or private funding, that should be included in the research study so that we can ask what's going on monetarily. We also want to think about what theory is being tested. So what is the actual theory, and is this the best test for it? So the theory was that facilitated learning was a successful way to communicate to people that science was saying no longer had higher brain functions. And the initial studies actually were set up to pretty much confirm this theory, but they really weren't set up to disconfirm the theory. They were actually kind of, the deck was stacked, if you will, to find further support. So we should also then ask questions about the journalists covering it. I'm not necessarily trying to badmouth media or media stories. Their job is to take very complex ideas and break it down into very quick stories that people will click on. But we also want to think about what are the questions the journalists are asking. And the initial actual release of this particular studies was actually in magazines and news sources that had an investment in those academies that were teaching people to be facilitated learners. So when we talk about how scientists approach the work, we want to ask the following questions. We want to make sure the scientists are empiricists, that they're using observation. We also want to make sure that they're actually testing their theories, that the methodology of the research is theory driven, but it's also driven to either confirm or disconfirm the actual theory itself. And theory, by the way, is often misunderstood. A lot of people say, well, it's just a theory. Well, theories are generally well supported by research. In other words, there already is a fair amount of research that's supporting the theory. We're just further dialing down to really get at what's going on. We want to make sure that the scientists are tackling applied and basic problems. So applied problems can be, are they actually looking at how to apply this theory to the real world? In other words, is there research based on giving information to practitioners to put this into use? Or are they just researching basic processes? And we'll talk about an example of that. So this research, looking at facilitated learning, was definitely applied research. It was trying to actually determine if a particular intervention was being successful and how we could actually determine if that was true or not. We do want our scientists to dig deeper. So part of that theory data cycle is not just accepting that all research that's come in the past has to be correct. We want to ask deeper questions. We want to ask, is there a better way to research this? Is there a better way to test the theory? And then once we've actually done that, we've got a rigorous study. It is theory driven. It is an empirical study, whether it's applied or basic. We want to actually make sure that it gets out to people, that there's the publication process. It makes it to the public. It gets attention of mass media. In other words, scientists need to talk to the world from journal to journalism. So how we actually communicate what's happening. And this can also be a problem, that there's some really good research out there that's incredibly dry and hard to read through. Generally speaking, science has been trying to come up with ways to better communicate to journalism. So when you read a research article, you'll often see an abstract, which is the scientist's own words of what is this study about in a paragraph or two. And that is, in fact, a way to communicate broadly without reading the entire research article. What were the primary findings? What were some of the concerns? To also communicate to journalists for when they're actually communicating this information as well. So I talked about the theory to data-driven cycle, and this is really what we're talking about, and it's a deep process that we start with a theory, and that theory may be driven by our own observations, it may be driven by past theories or past research, it may also be past literature reviews. And honestly, every paper is going to have a literature section, and that literature section is actually defining what is the theory, what's out there, what's been done in the past, and what am I actually looking at in this particular study. So this leads researchers to pose particular questions. And that leads us to the research question, which is usually the end of the literature review. It is, what is the appropriate research questions? What am I aiming to do? What are the questions that I want to either support or refute in this particular study? That's going to also lead us to our research design, which is the methodology of the session, which often ends with our actual specifically testable hypothesis. We then actually conduct the study, which is actually the results section generally. What is the data and how is that found? And we'll usually end, actually it's not on here, but basically with a discussion section that talks about how this particular study fits into the broader understanding of the theory and the lit review. So we start, another way to think about this is an hourglass. We start broad. What is the past research and the theory? And as we slowly narrow down, we get to a research question. Then we get to our specific design, which is tending towards the end of the start of the hourglass. And that specific design is also our results. We then talk about how those results actually apply to the bigger theory. And so we start to broaden it out. And the end of a research paper should be the big takeaway, if you will. So that's kind of the way we look at this. But once we've done a particular one single study, we started with a theory, it led us to research questions. We created a study, the methodology, the research design, with specifically testable hypotheses, and we've done the results and broadened it back out to the theory. We're then going to find out, does the data that we collected support the theory, or does it lead to revised theories or improved research designs? In other words, did the data not support the theory? Does that mean the theory was fully thrown out, or does that mean there was a problem with our research design? And this is going to lead us to additional studies. So if it's strongly supporting the theory, it's one more piece of information that says this theory seems to actually represent the real world. It's usable by practitioners. But we also can learn from data that disproves our theory. Was there a problem with our research design, or does the theory itself need to be revised? So another quick study that I want to talk about is an example of a basic research study. And this was just looking at human behavior and whether it was food or comfort that was most important to developing children. And this was a study that was done in the 50s, and it was actually done with small rhesus monkeys. And the idea was that initially, a lot of initial theories of human development basically said that we were reward and behavior creatures. In other words, if you reward a behavior, the behavior increases. And what's important as far as building a bond with our mothers is simply the production of food. In other words, food is what actually drove that connection. We were hungry, we would go to the food would provide a reward, and that reward is what we would go for. So what was basically done in this study, and it's a very basic, simple study, was if that's true, then rhesus monkeys should prefer a food-providing device over something that provides comfort and warmth. Now, this is not necessarily saying that we're not reward and behavior creatures. It was simply getting to what rewards and behaviors are important, and we found that there is actually a lot more than just food. So basically what happened was that monkeys were provided with two mothers, if you will, both of them artificial. One of them simply provided food. The other one actually had a furry surface and provided a little bit of warmth. The monkeys spent almost 23 hours a day on the warmth providing monkey that had a soft surface than the food providing monkey. In other words, they formed an emotional attachment with that provided comfort and warmth, not that which provided food. Now, this did not disprove behavioral psychology. It simply confirmed that it wasn't just a food base, that there were other factors that actually influenced our behavior. And this is another example of thinking about a very simple basic study. So we can ask the same questions. Was this an empirical study? Was it a theory-driven cycle? So it was starting with a theory, and in this case, it actually disproved the theory. The theory actually said that food was the primary motivator. This study actually suggested there were other factors that were more important. That yes, we are still reward-based creatures. The more rewards we get, the more likely our behaviors increase, but those rewards may be beyond just basic functions. This, in this case, was a basic problem, and the scientists did dig deeper. And in fact, enormous numbers of studies actually cited this study as they looked at further and further effects of what actually affects human behavior. And it's a fairly famous study, so the scientists were very successful at making it available to the public, the publication process. It's hard to find any basic book on human behavior that does not include some discussion of this study. So we definitely see the success of from journal to journalism in this case. So scientists typically tackle basic and applied problems. Basic research, under what conditions do people experience a rubber hand as their own hand? So we basically provide a study where we're looking at white noise, there's various vibrations and fixed lights, and we're looking at that. However, even basic research can translate to actual applied research. So can lessons from the rubber hand illusion be applied to the design of prosthetic hands? So we have basic research that basically says, yes, we can fool someone into believing that a rubber hand is actually theirs in certain conditions. The applied research then looks at which prosthetic hands design works best for your clients and feel more natural. So all of that kind of falls into itself. Now that isn't one single study, that was a series of studies that translated basic research into applied research. And again, we come back to this slide, the idea of we're always wanting to make sure that any science that we're consuming, that it is empirical and it's based on observational data, that we're actually testing some theory, whether that theory is based on just observations, and those observations should be well detailed in that case, or past research and literature review. What is the actual problem being tackled? Is it a basic problem, just understanding how things work, or is it more applied? Based on previous basic research, we're now trying to apply that research in a way that is going to inform practice. Do the scientists dig deeper? Do they hold themselves to a higher standard when they look at their methodology? And what have they done to make sure that that publication, if it's actually published and you're reading it, is making it to the public? How it gets from journal to journalism. So scientists make it public, the publication process. So I just briefly want to talk about the fact that there is a process, and it's a fairly long process to get something from a research study to actually being published in a journal. So what we start with is the manuscript. So once the study is done, we have a manuscript with a literature review, testable hypotheses, the methods that were used, the results that were found, and how that applies to the bigger picture. That manuscript is then going to be edited to fit the requirements of a journal and be submitted as a journal article. The role of journal editors is to determine whether that research itself is sound. So they're effectively consumers of research at this very start level. In other words, they're gatekeepers, if you will. They're determining, and there is a chance that they just simply say this is not a good fit for our journal, or we have problems with the methodology, and here they are. Before anything is moved forward, you need to redo this study if you have any chance of publishing it. Now, generally speaking, just because it's being rejected from a journal does not necessarily mean it's poor research. It may just be a poor fit for that particular journal. All journals tend to have a focus. If the journal editors determine that in their opinion it's somewhat sound and appropriate for their journal, they're now going to send it out to peer reviewers. And the role of peer reviewers is that basically peers, that means other scientists, other experts in the field, are going to be sent copies of that journal article, and they're going to be asked to review it. Do they find any issues? Are there any questions? Are there any research that should have been mentioned that wasn't mentioned? Is there any problems with the methodology? Is there any problems with the research, the statistics or the results that were found? Or even, are there any problems with the broad conclusions that were made? So based on this, each peer reviewer is going to suggest rejection, revision, or acceptance. Acceptance is pretty rare, especially for the first round. Generally speaking, anytime you submit a scientific research article to a journal, it's probably going to come back at best with revisions required. So again, peer reviews, on average, you're probably going to have at least 3 different experts looking at your research and giving you feedback. They may reject it wholesale, and they'll tell you why. They may ask for revisions. We want to see the following. We want to see this additional research discussed. We want to see your conclusions a little bit more focused. We want to see how you're actually doing your research. We may actually want additional analysis conducted. If based on that revision, you will then go through and you'll revise the article and resubmit it, which hopefully then will get that acceptance. If it's accepted, it's then going to be published. And now it's back to the journal and the journal editor's job to actually get that information out, to do press releases, and to try to get more eyes on that new research. So again, how scientists approach their work, the exact same process is occurring through this process as well. Again, the journal editors and those peer reviewers are being empiricists. They're asking, did you do the theory-driven data cycle? They're asking, is this more applied or basic? And that may be something the editors are determining, because it may be a journal focused on applied, it may be a journal focused on basic. And so example, if you have a very applied article being submitted to a journal that mainly does basic problems, they may reject it based on that alone. They're going to also dig deeper. They're going to ask additional questions. How did you do this? What are their problems? And if it does get published, they're going to also then be a part of that process of getting it from journal to journalism, generally through the editors. So again, this is just kind of a quick cartoon that walks through how the science news cycle happens. So you start here, your research, you find something. It goes to the university PR office or the journal's PR office. That then creates a blurb, which is sent out to the newswire organizations. Those newswire organizations probably are going to create a story based on the abstract and based on the press releases. Then it gets to the internet, which is trying to get clicks. So they're basically going to be putting out stories that basically exaggerate the findings. It hits the local news and the cable news and the major news networks, and that's an awesome thing. But what does it mean? Again, they're going to be looking for how does this actually affect our consumers? And our consumers are generally not practitioners. They're lay people. They're people that are just interested. And at the end of the day, it actually gets to your grandma where basically where your research started is going to actually end up in probably not necessarily the way that you think it's going to be. Now, some of that we can't control. Once it actually leaves and goes into the media, goes into the internet, and goes into individuals, we no longer have a direct control. But what information is being shared, how the research study is done, is always going to be the basis that we want to build on to try to reduce this impact as all possible. And that's really what we're hoping to get across in this, is to make you, as you consume research at the cable news level, at the local news level, at the internet level, be more pragmatic, if you will, be a better consumer, and ask the tougher questions so that when you see an article that basically says science is out to kill us and you click on it, you actually can go back to the original research and start asking these questions. So hopefully that gives you a broad idea of what we're covering in this class, and I look forward to talking to you next week.